I know in the past you spent a lot of time talking to Indian voters, not just in this election, but in previous ones as well. What do people vote for, and why do you think they may have turned against Narendra Modi?
Well, in this case, I think there are two points to make. One is that, remember, India has been holding elections for nearly 75 years now. So there is a democratic maturity in the voter. They have faced a number of elections. There are 3 tiers of democracy. They vote in 3 different kinds of elections within a 5-year period. So people have some understanding. The Indian voter is a very canny voter. They have a deep understanding of politics. You can stop pretty much anyone on the street, and they'll give you a reading of the season of the moon on the ground. And that's why, research on India is always so rewarding and interesting. So this is a voter that displays a certain democratic maturity. This maturity was brought into this particular election. It had to face 2 very different visions of India. There was the BJP-led vision of India, which was to convert a plural, diverse, secular, democratic India into one that was dominated by the Hindu majority, that had talked about distorting the Indian constitution. That is why they needed this huge majority. And they made these claims. Several of their leaders made these claims. And on the other side was an alliance that had been put together by parties who have been enemies in the past. But they have come together because the one single common denominator of the India alliance was that they were going to defend constitutional values, that they stood for pluralism, that they stood for diversity, that they stood for freedom of press, that public institutions would be respected, and so on. So these were the 2 choices in front of all voters. And whatever the verdict today, the final verdict, is going to be whether the Indian voter wants to preserve its constitution and create the kind of democracy that India aspired to create in 1947 when it wrote its constitution and launched it in 1950, or is it going to take it down a totalitarian, authoritarian, majoritarian route, which we can no longer call a democracy?
Yeah, I was going to ask you whether you think the elections are free or fair. I think we can tell from what you're saying you don't. But what would be the reasons for it not being free and fair? What has, in your mind, gone wrong, do you think, in India?
Well, to start with, people should note that the rules for the appointment of the election commissioners was changed by this government through its majority in parliament, so that the 3 chief election commissioners who are at the top of the Election Commission of India were now a partisan body. There were constitutional checks to make them a non-partisan body. That law was changed by this government. So that was the first red signal, right? That it was a warning. The second thing is that I think it is fair to say, and everybody will agree with this, that never before within most of our living memory have elections been held in India where so many questions about the very conduct of the electoral process have been raised as they have been this time. Let me give you one example. When Indian elections are announced, from that day onwards, there is something called the Model Code of Conduct that comes into play, which is imposed on all political actors, whether in opposition or in government. This Model Code of Conduct is quite zealously, normally enforced by the Election Commission of India. And I should say that the Election Commission of India has had a terrific track record in conducting and trying to make the election process better and better. But this time, the Model Code of Conduct, which has very stringent rules about hate speech, about use of religion in campaigning and so on, was not enforced. And yesterday, and so we saw Prime Minister Modi through these 7 phases of elections, it's been a very long election, getting more and more polarizing in his discourse, calling Muslims infiltrators, to say that to misrepresent the opposition's manifesto, making really quite stark comments, which frankly in the past would have been censured by the Election Commission of India. And this time the election commissioners held a press conference yesterday, and they admitted themselves that we had taken a decision not to touch the top 2 leaders of both the incumbent government and the opposition, which is an extraordinary claim to make, because there is nowhere in the model code of conduct that requires you to do it. And even by that, there were plenty of BJP chief ministers from provincial governments and other leaders who were also not censured, and they're certainly not amongst the top two, who made such polarizing statements. That is one example. The second thing is,
Mukulika, I think I'm going to have to interrupt you. Sorry, we've run out of time, but we got your points there. So thank you very much for talking to us on the programme today. Mukulika Banerjee from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.